So thanks for coming out on this rainy day. Like she said, my name is Haley. I'm the curator of the Cayuga Museum. We are going to talk a little bit about a lot of stuff today. So we're going to talk about the lab, the history of the families that lived in the Willard Case mansion, the women who worked at the lab, and then we're going to talk a little bit about women just from the county who contributed to science as well. And then we're going to round it all off by talking about what we can do in the modern world to emphasize the importance of science to young girls to continue their education into spheres like at the Case Research Laboratory. So just to start, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that the Cayuga Museum is just down the road. If it wasn't raining, I would have just walked here because it's so close. But the museum was established in 1936 when a group of locals were looking to establish a museum, and that was led by a man named Walter Long, who again, many Auburn people are familiar with Mr. Long. He was quite a figure. But it was essentially given to this group of people by Theodore Case in 1936. I say practically given because it was $1 for the cost, so that's a pretty reasonable amount of money for the amount of property that they got. And ever since then, we've been a museum and we've been operating with sort of talking about county history with a focus on science, technology, film, art, and history. So the mansion property as it was in the 1800s is such in this photo. So if you've been to the museum, you'll know that we have the big mansion, which is our main building. We have the laboratory, which is this smaller building, and then we have the carriage house. So in the 1800s, there were a number of other properties on the property, such as this big greenhouse that was destroyed by hail. If you've seen our giant ginkgo tree behind our property, it's exactly where this used to be. So it was planted where that was destroyed. But the purpose of showing you this is to show you what the lab used to be. So when we talk about the laboratory, it was once a greenhouse. That was the original building. So imagine like in the summer, it gets very, very hot because we don't have AC. And in the winter, it gets very, very cold because we don't have heat either. So it's kind of a temperamental building. But this is what it looked like in the era of the Willard Case family. We'll start with a little bit of background about the Willards. So whenever I talk about the Cases or the Willards or the lab, I like to sort of set it up so you understand that this was all possible because these families were incredibly wealthy and they came from very affluent families. So we'll start with the Willards. The patriarch was Sylvester Willard. He got a lot of his money from investing in cornstarch. So he was an investor in the Oswego starch factory, which was the factory that first boxed cornstarch into like uniform packages. And his father-in-law and her brother were both very big investors in this company as well. So Theodore Pettibone Case, for whom this library is named, the Case Memorial Library, was once the richest man in Auburn. And that's sort of where you get to these guys and see that wealth trickle down from him. Jane Frances Willard was a Case, so that's how we have the Case connection. And then their two daughters, Georgiana and Caroline, were their only children. They never got married. They never had their own kids. So the Willard line died with these ladies. If you've ever been to the Willard Memorial Chapel, that's the legacy that they've given to Auburn. So they dedicated that chapel to their parents' memory, and it still stands today. So then we have the Cases. When Georgiana and Caroline passed away, they didn't have any male heirs. So the property went to their next male relative, which was Willard Case. Mr. Case was a lawyer by trade, as a lot of wealthy people were, but he never actually practiced law, which is kind of a funny, weird thing about him. He was very interested in science, which is what he preferred to spend his time doing. So he was very sort of into electricity specifically. So if you guys are familiar with Casawasco, which is in Moravia, he built the first hydroelectric engine that powered Casawasco. So that was something that he did early on in his sort of experiment phase of life. He married Ava Caldwell, who then became a Case, and they went on to have two children, Theodore Case and Dorothy Case. I like to point out Dorothy because she's a bit of a mystery in the Case family. There are no photos of her. There's barely any information about her, and we don't really know much about her personal life at all. She married a man with the last name Whitehouse. So she was Dorothy Case Whitehouse, but that's pretty much literally all we know. We know that from Ted Case's laboratory notebooks that she did assist with some of his experiments, or was at least attended some of his experiments, but he never really wrote in depth about her involvement. So she's a little bit of a mystery. But our primary focus for the laboratory is really Ted and his father, who both established the laboratory together in 1916. So this is a laboratory as it was in 1920. It looks very much the same today, only we've added some railing and ramps and things that make it a little bit more accessible. But like I said, it was established in 1916 by Ted and his father. And when they first opened, they hired a number of scientists to assist them. So this included chemists, electricians, stenographers, laboratorians, which is just a fancy word for assistant, essentially, and all sorts of things. And the majority of these people were men, but a large number of them were also women. So there were about 11 women that we know of that worked at the laboratory between 1916 and 1920. So that's a pretty big chunk of their workforce during that time, almost half. So that era of the Case lab was primarily run by women, really. But we will focus for just one second on the men who ran the lab. So here we have Ted. His right-hand man, so I call him, is this man. His name is Earl Sponable. And Mr. Sponable is well known in the world of film because he went on to work for 20th Century Fox until the 60s. And he won an Academy Award in the 50s for developing CinemaScope. So he did a lot outside of just what the lab did. And I kind of refer to him as like the Hollywood man when I talk about him because he was very involved in like New York studios and moving the studios from New York to California. So a lot about him in that regard. These other guys, this is Pennington Sefton. His father was a doctor who was like a close family friend, and he helped the lab as a manager. This guy is Blinn Cushman. He was a chemist. And this is Charles Steele. He was also a chemist. So these 5 guys and a couple more kind of made up the core sort of head decision makers of the laboratory. But as I said before, it wasn't just men. And the inventions that they were working on in those early days, excuse me, primarily related to photoelectric research. And that's really just a fancy way of saying light, sound, energy connections kind of thing. So what they were trying to make in those early days were devices called photoelectric cells, which can be used in research in a variety of ways. So think, for example, if you have one of these devices, you might put it in a field to see where the best light is to plant crops. So you could use it in agriculture, you could use it in testing dyes. So something that they did was put it up to like where a fabric that was dyed was, and they would see how much light it took to fade the dye so that they could adjust to make it a little bit less or more or whatever they needed to do. So that was the primary research, just basically making these little light bulbs was the first thing that they did. Through this work, they were able to create something called an infrared signal, which we'll talk about more in depth in a moment, and an AEO light, which is the small component that really made sound on film possible. Sound on film is a little bit out of the scope of what we're going to talk about today. So if you're particularly interested in that, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, or you can always come take a tour and learn probably way too much about sound on film. But the AEO light then led to the creation of the Movietone sound on film system, which was the Fox Case system, eventually the 20th Century Fox system. So this is sort of the primary things that they were making, the big things, I would say. And here are some images of those items. So the thalified cell is one of those photoelectric devices. That is the device that allowed them to do infrared signaling because it actually can detect infrared light, so invisible light. This is that AEO light. So again, just a tiny, unassuming little light bulb is what made sound on film possible. And then this is the camera that this was inside of. So this is, again, just the legacy, kind of the journey through the lab's inventions. So now we'll get to the women that worked there. So I mentioned a lot of women worked there, but almost all of them were assistants. So none of them were chemists, none of them were electricians. They were all deemed laboratorians, except for one lady who was a stenographer, which is a fancy word for like a typist. But there are a couple exceptions in the history of the Case Lab's women. So there were two ladies named Alice Gertrude Eldred Case, you can see here, and another lady named Margaret Tryon, who were trained as glass blowers. So they were doing more unique things in the lab. They were making some of those bulbs that we saw just before, and different things that they might need, like test tubes or beakers or whatever. So they were trained in this. Interestingly, Gertrude here in the photo, she joined the lab in 1917. So she was straight out of high school. She went to Auburn High School. And she must have really hit it off with Ted Case because they got married in 1918. So she started working there in 1917, got married in 1918, and the two of them went on to have 4 children together. We'll talk a little bit more about what that meant for women in a little bit, but just so you know, this is Ted Case's wife. Here you can see an example from the laboratory notebooks. So we have tons of these, thousands of pages of information that Ted Case left us. And so we've really had to glean information out of them as carefully as we can. So when I was doing research a couple years ago on the laboratory to make a new tour, I discovered all of the information about the women who were working on different things. So here you can see they took notes about Miss Tryon and Miss Eldred working on tube work and working on blowing glass. And this is one of the big ways that we know anything that they were doing. Really, they only talk about these 2 women. There's only one other woman that they ever really mention by name, and again, it's the stenographer. And she had a bit of an issue with like a workers' compensation thing, so I think that's why they write about her specifically. But you can see they were kind of focusing on this work that they were doing because it was more unique than what the other women were doing at the time. These are some of the other women. So that's Margaret Tryon, who we just talked about. You'll start to see last names that all look the same. So Margaret Tryon Eldred, Gertrude Eldred Case, Rosamond Eldred, Beatrice Eldred. These were all relatives of one another. So Margaret married into Gertrude's family. She married one of her brothers, so they were sister-in-laws. Rosamond was her cousin, was Gertrude's cousin, and Beatrice was her sister. So in a lot of ways, this was like a family affair. Like they were bringing in members of their family, and they were all working together on this stuff. But there were women who worked there and men who were not related. So the only other person we have an image of is Laura Carpenter. And we were just very lucky to have a yearbook that had her picture in it because she graduated the same year as Gertrude did. We knew Frances Whalen, Joan Cheeseman, Nancy Hunt, Bernadine Schneider, and May Gleason. So these are all the women who worked at the lab. Bernadine is the stenographer. She's the longest employee that was a woman. So she worked there from probably like 1917 until 1930. So she was there for a long time. And then May Gleason is the only other woman who's mentioned one time in the lab notebooks. And she's mentioned because, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but she's the only other woman that's mentioned by name. So during World War I, we know that we were working on this infrared signal for the Navy. So Case was contracted with the United States military to create a communication system that would work from ship to ship, and that was impossible to intercept. So what they created was this infrared signaling system that you would actually have one on each ship, and you would be able to send infrared Morse code messages from ship to ship. And the reason that this is so important to the history of women is that this is the only device that we know the women really worked on, and that they worked on it a lot. And partly we know that because of these documents that I have here. So essentially, if you know what an NDA is, this is an NDA, so a non-disclosure agreement. It basically says that if you're working on this device, you're not going to talk about it, or else essentially we're going to go to prison. So Case made people sign these because he was actually sent basically a cease and desist from the government that said, you can't talk about what you're doing because it's top secret military information. And he said, oh yes, okay, I won't. So he drafted these, but the really unique thing about them is that if you can read them from where you're sitting, you'll see that they say herself and they say she. So they only use female pronouns, which leads us to believe that he only made women sign them, which is pretty pretty weird, I would say. So he only made women sign them, and we only have copies that are signed by women. So this is Alice Gertrude Eldred's copy. But that's how we know all the names of those women that weren't mentioned in the notebooks, because we have all these documents. But again, I think when I discovered this and I read them and I noticed that they were in female pronouns, I thought, I wonder if it's just like that sexist thing, which is like loose lips sink ships of the time kind of thing, because like no man signed it. So they just had full faith that they would not say anything. But I'm a little bit grateful for this now because I know all of their names. I say all that. Case was not at all trying to hide that women were working on stuff. He was not trying to diminish their value or their contributions. He actually mentions them by name in an article to the Auburn Citizen, where he thanks the people who worked on it, as well as Gertrude, Beatrice, Rosamond, Joan, Margaret, May, Laura, and Frances. So he lists them all by name, which is very big of him, I think, to do that. And again, that's how we know specifically what they were working on. Back to May, I couldn't find this when I was looking back to make this presentation, but we know that she's the one who actually made the filter that's on the signal that filtered out visible light and only let infrared pass through. So they mention her by name and say that she's the one who made it. So I have a feeling that she was a little bit more than a laboratorian, but they just don't really get into it all that much, which is a bit of a shame. And then we kind of have to talk about what happened to the women later in their lives. So a lot of women in the 19th and 20th centuries were just wives and mothers. That was their role. That was the expectation. So for these women who were working, once they got married, they kind of fell back into that traditional role. So Gertrude, when she was married and had her first baby, she stopped working in the lab. So she was still part of the family and like very much involved in what was going on, but she was no longer an employee in the whatever you call it, where you find if people are employees. I can't think of the word. But a lot of the women in the 1920s, starting in 1920, got married, left the case lab, and that was kind of the end of their story. And through my research, trying to find more about them, it's extremely difficult to find more about them because once they got married, they were listed in the directories, and that's the word, directories, under their husband's name. So they kind of disappeared from history, so to speak. Like I mentioned before, only one woman remained in the lab throughout the 20s, and that was Bernadine Schneider. She signed off on a lot of patents that Case did. So she was a patent witness a lot. Again, that weird workers' comp thing, which I found like just kind of funny. I don't know. She's mentioned a lot in the notebooks. So she was a big part of what they were doing throughout the sort of movie tone Fox Case era as well. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about the Case women. So the family is very interesting. I mentioned Gertrude obviously was a very unique woman for working at the lab, but she went on to do a lot of stuff outside of science and outside of Auburn that kind of changed her life. So in the 40s, she and Case got divorced. So they got divorced in 1941. And when they got divorced, she was working as a gray lady for the American Red Cross. She went on to work for the Cuban embassy until Fidel Castro took power. And she did a lot of stuff like that, like giving back to her community. She lived in DC for a while, and I've spoken to living members of her family who visited her in DC and remember her being so gracious and welcoming and really enjoying those experiences. One of the Case daughters, so I mentioned they had 4 children. They had 2 daughters and 2 sons. One of the Case daughters, Jane Case Tuttle, who unfortunately just recently passed away in the last year, she was 100, so she lived a very long, wonderful life. She served during World War II as a code girl, so she broke codes for the U.S. Navy. And I've spoken to her on the phone a few times, and she still to this day will not talk about what she did specifically. So she's keeping that promise. But she will talk about how she loved her experience and really wishes she could have done it more as well. Unfortunately, when she was in the military during World War II, Ted Case died, so that was in 1944. So she also remembers coming back to Auburn for the funeral and then having to finish out the war after her father's death. So a lot of kind of trauma there. A part of it that I didn't include her photo, but Ted's mom, excuse me, we learned a lot about her recently that was kind of interesting that we're still working on piecing together. But essentially, for the majority of her life, when she was living with Ted and their family, she was actually institutionalized. And that's something that's not spoken about. They don't talk about it. It's not something that was common knowledge. So we're working to piece together what was going on in that story as well. So lots of interesting things going on in the Case family. So more broadly, women in science in the 19th and 20th centuries, we'll talk about this just a little bit. Women seeking careers in science were often facing intense discrimination and a lot of restrictions. So it wasn't even until 1837 that women were allowed to attend college at all. And they were not able to attend coeducational colleges for even longer after that. So the first woman who actually graduated medical school was a woman named Elizabeth Blackwell, and that was in 1848. And yeah, you're all about it. And she went to the Boston Female Medical College in 1848. So this kind of discrimination was long lasting. Up until 1910, there were very segregated colleges. So in 1910, only about 58% of colleges were coeducational. So even by, Case's time, Gertrude's time, they were very much separated. I have a picture of Marie Curie here because I want to touch on the fact that women have not always received recognition and honor. Obviously today, Marie Curie is a very well-known scientist. She's a Nobel Prize winner, a twice-time Nobel Prize winner. And for a long time during her life, she was kind of seen as like her husband's assistant. So a lot of her work was given the credit to her husband, which they very much worked together. So it wasn't like he wasn't doing anything and she wasn't doing anything, but she received a lot less credit for a long time. And this was a very common thing, so much so that this phenomenon has a name, which is called the Matilda effect. Which is a phenomenon where people perceive men as more competent in science because they fit the image of a typical scientist. And this term was coined by a woman named Margaret Rossiter, who's a professor at Cornell. And it's named after somebody who you might be familiar with, which is Matilda Joslyn Gage, who's a very famous American women's suffragist. And the reason it's named after her is because she wrote extensively on women in inventions or in innovation and in science in a booklet called Women as Inventor. So she was the first woman that really put together a list of women who were working comprehensively in science and tech in the late 1800s. So kind of a fun thing. And I really like the quote that Margaret Rossiter has here, which is, "As scientists, they were atypical women, but as women, they were unusual scientists." So a lot of women during this time period didn't really fit into the traditional spheres of womanhood, but they also didn't fit into the traditional spheres of science. So they were kind of outcasts from everywhere they went. Excuse me. I also really like this quote, which is that women's access to science was exclusionary, but even still, women have always contributed to scientific endeavors. So despite the fact that we're talking about the exclusion of women, or the fact that the women at the lab were assistants, not chemists or whatever, it doesn't really matter because we know that these women contributed and we know that their contributions are what made a lot of big scientific things possible, such as at the lab with our women. So we don't like to talk about them not existing. Here in Cayuga County, some names that you might have heard if you're really into history. We have some women who have contributed to other fields of science, specifically medical science. So the four that we're going to touch on briefly are Amanda Sanford Hickey, Anna Hutchinson Searing, Eliza Mosher, and Elizabeth Haight Garrow. Does anybody, like, those names ring a bell for anybody? Some people? A little bit of familiarity? You hear that one? Yeah. So these ladies, again, all of them were in the medical fields. So we'll start with Amanda because she kind of has the biggest legacy in some ways. So she was born in Rhode Island, but she moved to Scipioville, so that's where she lived. And as a young girl, she was very interested in science and pursuing medical science specifically. She was going to college, excuse me, in the era where these coeducational colleges existed and you couldn't really compete with men for spots at top medical colleges. So she went to, excuse me so much, I have something in my throat, the University of Michigan for her medical degree, and she wrote her thesis on eclampsia. So she was very interested in women's obstetrics. That was her focus. And when she moved to Auburn and set up a practice, she also started working at the Auburn City Hospital. She actually helped found it. And when she founded it, they made sure to put in a specific wing for women and women's obstetrics to help better the sort of expectations of maternal health, the likelihood that babies would survive, and things like that. So she really had a focus on ensuring the success of obstetrics in Auburn. Interestingly, she was also the first physician in Cayuga County to perform a tracheotomy. Oh, thank you. Which saved the life of a 6-year-old child. So she did that. And a tracheotomy is a very brutal procedure even today. So the fact that she was able to do it and save this child in the mid 1800s is pretty phenomenal. Because again, it's an extremely brutal thing to do. And then we'll talk about Anna Hutchinson Searing. She was another woman who was very interested in medicine. She also taught with Emily Howland at one of the minor schools. So she had connections to suffrage, medicine, all sorts of things. She also received her degree at the Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she worked particularly on indigestion. So kind of a weird thing to get into, but she was into it. Important. Important, yes. Yes. The next person who you might be more familiar with is Eliza Mosher. She was very interested in posture. So she made a lot of sort of devices and wrote a lot of patents related to posture devices. So a couple of them that are interesting are this desk that is meant to be better for your posture. So you can see it's almost like a standing desk today. So you would stand instead of sit, so you would be able to stand more properly. This is actually a bike seat. So this was to make your posture better on your bike. And then there's also the kind of most famous one that I should have included is a corset that helps women's posture to be more upright. In the museum, we have the patents, the original patents for that. So you can see sort of her ideas and things. She's from Ledyard, so she's from the county. And there's a really funny quote that I have here, which is that when she first applied to medical school, she applied to a school that didn't allow women in. So the response from the person who was admitting people was basically to say, we can't have the mixed presence of the sexes because it will offend the delicacy and refinement of women. So kind of a weird thing to be said. But she did eventually get into school and she went on to receive her medical degree. Oh, let me start. Sorry, there's one last person, which is Elizabeth Garrow. She worked with Eliza Mosher, so they were friends with each other, so they were both kind of interested in similar topics. She went to the New England Hospital for Women and Children. That's where she received her education. And there's unfortunately not that much known about her outside of that, but she and Eliza set up a practice in Poughkeepsie once they were done in this area. And they were actually resident physicians at Vassar College together. So these are things that they did sort of at the same time. So now we're going to talk about that part, which is the modern woman in STEM. So I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, so I don't really fit into the science thing, but my sister is a biologist, she's an embryologist, so I always think of women in science and I think of her and her education and things like that. So we will talk a little bit about what it looks like for women like her today. So roughly 31% of women are studying a STEM core subject. That means like biology, chemistry, something like that. That's a pretty low number, I would say, especially given that the core STEM subjects are also like what lead to medical subjects. So the majority of women in STEM today are doing so to pursue medical education, so nursing, doctoring, things like that. So again, kind of a weird low number. And then you can see it broken down even further to sort of get why that low number is like it is. So in the physical sciences, only 44% are women in college, only 37 are in math, 23 in computer science, and 21 in engineering. So even though we've made a lot of good progress and made strides to make it more easy for women to be in these fields of science, you can see that there are ones that are still quite exclusionary. And that's for a lot of reasons. I think that women, or young girls, I should say, are not as encouraged to pursue those fields as men might be, especially obviously computer science and technology and engineering. My best friend is a computer scientist. That was her degree. And every single class she had, she was the only girl. So it was very uphill for her. And I took a couple of those classes with her, and I can definitely say why there aren't more women, and it's because you don't feel comfortable and you don't feel welcome in those spaces, or at least I didn't. So this is sort of the experience of that. Math as well. I think we've all heard the rumor or the stereotype that women can't do math. You learn that as a young girl, and you take that to your adulthood and you think, I'll never be able to do math. So that sort of shows that statistic there. This is again over the years to kind of show trends and changes. So graduating in core STEM subjects from 2016 to 22, there was an increase, but it's very slight. So 21% to 26%. And then when you break it down into science professionals, so people who have graduated and entered the workforce, again, you see slight trends in increase from 41 to 44. But again, there's still quite a divide in those things. Interestingly to note, when I was doing research for this as well, 2020, obviously a weird year for everybody, actually had more women in STEM than ever before. I think women were encouraged or kind of fired up about this trying to get rid of COVID thing. So more women were interested in pursuing scientific careers, but then it dropped back down to below 45% after that. So what does this mean for modern women or modern girls? I think that the big takeaway when you think about women in science and you look at the histories of women in science is that the only way to change the story is to encourage the next generation to be more involved in something. So when I was growing up, I was born in 1994, so my education was mostly in the early 2000s. I never was encouraged to pursue anything other than playing my flute in the band. Like that was the only thing I was told to do. But my brother was inspired to be a chemist. He's doing his PhD in chemistry, and he's a very good mathematician. So we were of the same family, of the same background, and yet encouraged to do vastly different things because I grew up in a very patriarchal household. I think if we teach young girls about STEM and provide opportunities for hands-on learning at a young age, that they'll be just as good at it as the boys. And if we challenge stereotypes and encourage girls to pursue math, science, and technology, we can overcome this divide in the sciences, which is very important to me particularly. So thanks for joining me. That was a lot.